Well, hello. How are you doing today? It's 5 o'clock here, Central Standard Time on Wednesday. So we are going live and we are going to have, I'm going to have a little bit of fun. Hopefully you will as well. We've got a really interesting conversation to have. We're going to be talking about some of the weird things, supernatural experiences that the Bible talks about, and taking a look at how to think about those things and whether or not there's something that's important for us today. So it's 11 p.m. for you. You're probably in England then, England, Great Britain time. So welcome. We've got Virginia Beach. Welcome. Glad you're here. As you guys are hopping on, go ahead and let me know where you're coming in from. And we'll kind of start this conversation. I was filming today. We were able to get through all of our Streams Academy Phase 2, Module 2 teachings, which was a lot of fun. I think it was something like 33,000 words total just in the notes, just for an outline of that one. And it's really rich. Scotland. I love Scotland. One of my favorite places in the world to go. Awesome. Let's see. We've got Georgia, we got Massachusetts, Alabama, a few people from Texas. We've got Mexico. Welcome. Glad you could join us. Tennessee. Welcome. Well, glad you guys are here. So let's start this conversation. This is I'm trying to figure out the way I want to say this. This topic can be really controversial. It can also be really exciting. Some people love this topic. Some people hate this topic. And a lot of it has to do with the way that we see the world. Part of the teaching that we just finished up, we were talking about worldview and how worldview affects the way that we see things, the way that we perceive things. And one of the worldviews is naturalism, which just says that what we can see in nature defines reality. So nature is a closed system and all of the definitions are visible. It's the basic worldview that's underneath science and scientific exploration as it currently is, not as it was originally started, because science was started as an understanding of God's creation. But it also, because of that, there's an inherent distrust of anything that you cannot quantify and repeat at will. And so somebody with a naturalistic worldview would make a comment like, well, if healing is available, why don't you just go into a hospital and heal everybody that's sick? Because if it's real, then it's repeatable and you can control it. And once you've figured it out, you can make it happen whenever you want to happen. Completely removes the relational aspect and a real understanding of the spiritual world and the way that it works. There is so much related to that. When you start taking a look at the Bible, it actually, that naturalistic worldview at some extremes will actually discount anything supernatural. I mean, to some extent, like some of the liberal theologians of the 20th century made suggestions like the language about demons wasn't because they were actually demons. It was just the best that they could do to understand mental illness. And so they called it demons. This is somebody that is starting from a naturalistic worldview and reinterpreting scripture from that. And my premise is that scripture must be the lens by which we understand life. Life is not the lens by which we understand scripture. Now, it's really hard to do because most of us do not recognize the assumptions that we have about the world and the things that are in the world. But when you start reading scripture just for what it says, instead of changing scripture to fit a worldview, there's some really weird stuff in scripture. And some of it is really weird and some of it is just interesting. Some of it is just odd. but it's actually an invitation to us. So here's another premise that I have. I always start from scripture. So my view is to the best of my ability, and everybody is in process. So I know I'm still in process, but I am constantly challenging what I think by what the scripture says. So scripture says that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And there's a consistency from Genesis all the way to Revelation of certain supernatural experiences. So the premise is that if God has done it in the past, he could do it again. Now, that is not saying that just because God did it in the past, he has to do it again, but he could. Anything that he has done, he could do. Now, he can also do stuff that he hasn't done before. He's actually God. So he is bigger than the experiences that we have had and that have been able to be communicated by humans from their experiences. So that starting point allows us to take a look at some of the things that are in scripture in a different way. Here's one of my favorite ones. So Abraham is going through, he's trying to find this promised land that God had told him about. And so he's traveling. He ends up in Canaan, and God says, hey, look at it. You're in the land. And so he's setting up his camp, and he's got his tents all set up, all of his people, all of his flocks. And he's sitting out in front of the tent one day, and he sees three guys walking by. And when he sees the three guys, he does what anybody in that time period, especially in the Middle East, would do. He offers them hospitality. Hey, turn aside. Can you come in? Let me get you some food. Let me get you some drink. And there's a few different things that are going on. I mean, if at that point in time, if you wanted to know the news, the only way you're going to get the news is to get somebody to tell you. They didn't have TV. They didn't have internet. Nobody was posting on social media. So you wanted to hear what was going on in another place. You had to talk to somebody that had been there. So somebody that's traveling, like, this is a great opportunity. I'm going to be able to get some information. I'm going to be able to hear what's going on. And you offer them hospitality. You have conversations. You get news of what's happening. Oh, there's a new king over here. This is going on. Yeah, there's a famine over here. Or there's wealth over here, or whatever. So you get news. That's one part. But also there was just this inherent belief that giving hospitality to someone else was important, because how you treated other people is how you're going to be treated. That also is a biblical concept. So Abraham talks him into staying. He gets him in. He starts getting food. He's making bread. He's getting the meat. He's putting everything together. It says, and he washes their feet. At some point in time in this conversation, he realizes these are not just people. There's something unique going on. Now, whether that was before the prophecy started, because they started talking, hey, where's your wife? Hey, did she's going to be pregnant a year from now. She's going to have a child. There's all of a sudden, there's a recognition. Wait a second, there's more going on than just some people that hear. It's likely that he was recognizing something more earlier. But he gets up, after they've eaten, he's served them, he's washed their feet. He gets this prophetic word that he recognizes they're from God. So at this point, is he realizing that they're angels? Is he thinking that they're messengers? Does he know that it's God? We don't know. But the Bible clearly says that one of those three people that sat down, that ate food, and that got their feet washed was God himself. Not just an angel. I mean, angels are cool, but not very cool compared to God. Like, he actually had God sit down in his tent in physical form and eat food before Jesus showed up. That's pretty wild. We think of angels, we think of spiritual beings in a certain way. Now, it wasn't just God that showed up and got their feet washed and ate food. It was the angels as well. So we usually think of angels today, and much of charismatic teaching, and I've been around for a little while, heard different ones talk about angelic visitations, and it's rare to hear someone talk about a physical manifestation, though that does happen. But there's this idea of a visionary experience where we perceive an angel in the room. And I've had that experience. I've had one or two times where I wondered afterwards that perhaps this was a physical, person that I thought was physical, was a person, was actually physical and was an angel. Like, but we don't often talk about that part of it. But that is a possibility. It's a possibility it's an angel. It's a possibility that it's the Lord himself. There is a possibility that someone could offer a meal to someone and end up feeding God. That's fun. That's really fun. There was a couple stories out of church history. So one of my favorite of the Desert Fathers was one of the first Desert Fathers, Anthony. He was called Anthony the Great by some. He was one of the first of the Desert Fathers, and he actually was out in the desert, and he was known for his visionary experiences, people seeing God and hearing from God, and he meeting God. And at one point in time, he was talking to some of the community because people had gathered around to learn about the ways of God, to pray together, and to spend time seeking after God. They would fast and they would work and they would pray and they would worship and read scripture and encourage one another to grow closer to God. And so this community is around, and Anthony is sharing some of his experiences, and some of the other people that are there said, "Hey, Anthony, like you've had experiences seeing God. Could we have an experience seeing God?" And so he's, well, let me ask the Lord. And so he's praying, and he felt like the Lord said, yeah, they'll be able to see me. Tell them to come up to the top of this hill at this time tomorrow, and they'll see me. And so he tells everybody, hey, yeah, you're going to see God, come up to this particular hill. He pointed out the hill. He said, and we'll go up there. And if we go at this time, the Lord said that he's going to meet with us and we would see him. And so then the next day, everybody is excited. They're doing their work and doing what they would normally do, but they're all looking forward to this experience. And so they start going up this hill to meet with God because they're all looking forward to seeing God. And there was an older cripple that was on the path that was going up the hill, and he was sitting there. And as people would go by, he would ask, where are you guys going? Oh, we're going up to the top of the hill. We're going to be meeting with God. Oh, that's wonderful. I would love to see God. And next one, where are you going? Oh, we're going up to the top of the hill to meet with God. And we're like, oh, I would love to see God. And this happened multiple times. Well, Anthony at this time, he was elderly. He lived into his 90s, and he was elderly. And he comes by this gentleman, and the same thing happens. Where are you going? Oh, I'm going to the top of the hill to see God. You go, oh, I would love to see God. And Anthony says, well, I don't have much strength, but I think I have enough strength to carry you. Let me get you on my back. And so he helps this old man get on his back, and he's holding him, and he bends over under the weight of him, and he's walking up the hill because the man's crippled. He can't walk. And as he's walking up the hill, the guy starts getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And finally, Anthony collapses under the weight of this man that's on his back. And as he rolls over and looks at this man, he's no longer a crippled old man that's skin and bones. He looks like you would picture Jesus. He's standing there. He's got the holes in his hands and feet. And he said, my people, they all saw me, but they missed me. And Jesus disappears. And so Anthony walks up to the top of the hill, and he sits down. And after a while, people are like, well, what time did God say he was going to be here? He said, well, he said, if we got here at this time, we would all see him. So they waited, and then people were getting uncomfortable. Like, when are we going to, is God actually going to show up? When are we going to see God? And Anthony says, well, you've already met him. You already saw him. Like, no, we didn't. He never showed up. We've been sitting here waiting. He's like, oh, no, 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 no. You saw him. Huh? You saw the old man on the side of the road, the crippled man. Oh, yeah, we saw him. That was him. And he explains what it was that had happened. They'd all missed him because he showed up in a form that they didn't expect. That is one experience. There's another one of one of my favorite mystics, historic figures is I just went to say Anthony again, Francis. So Francis of Assisi. Francis of Assisi, again, a beautiful heart for the Lord, spent his life pursuing God after he found the Lord. His young life, he didn't spend pursuing the Lord. He spent pursuing fame and glory and finances. But when God got hold of him, he spent his life pursuing the Lord. And there's a story from one point in his ministry. He was so struck with with ministering to the poor that he was ministering to a poor person at one point in time. And I think he was known to, sometimes he would trade his garments. So whatever clothes that he was wearing, if he saw somebody begging that didn't have as good a clothes as he is, he would just switch him garments. Like, here, I'll give you my clothes if you give me yours, and give him the better clothes, and would trade with him so that the person would be better clothed. And so I think it was that experience, or maybe he was giving him alms, but he was giving this person something, and the person turned into Jesus, and he had this encounter with the Lord, and he understood that scripture, if you've done it to the least of these, you've done it into me, that there's more to that sometimes than the symbolism that's related. And we could talk about that some other time. It's not the point of today, but he had this experience where he met the Lord. Now, in scripture, we have times where Jesus would show up and he didn't look like everybody expected. He looked different than people expected him to look. So that kind of thing happens. So you've got physical manifestations of people showing up, eating food, getting their feet washed, conversating, talking, showing themselves, revealing themselves, and that stuff still happens today. There are times when God shows up in the flesh physically. Angels show up in the flesh physically and interact with us, as well as the times when they show up in visionary forms, maybe in dreams or in visions and other experiences. So we have that. Now, here's another one of the weird experiences that's in scripture. Now, this one, it's clearly in the ministry of Ezekiel, though Jesus did this at least one time. And it's called levitations. Now, people get kind of funny about the word levitation. It's just a descriptive term that means that somebody's floating, meaning that they're not actually on the ground like everybody else. Where's that in scripture? Well, go to Ezekiel. Ezekiel had this happen a number of times, a couple of them where he was floating and then he was taken to other places. And sometimes he was just floating and then he would end up communicating. He ended up prophesying. So one time he's talking to the elders, all the elders of Israel gathered around him, and they're looking for a word from the Lord. And it says, and the hand of the Lord picked me up by the hair of his head. So he felt the hand grab his hair and lifted me between earth and heaven. So took him off the ground where he's hanging in the air, and he starts prophesying. Now, think about that for just a second. What would you do if you were in church and, let's say, guest minister or maybe the pastor or whoever it is that's speaking just started levitating a few feet off of the ground? Like, that would be a little bit weird for most people. We don't really have a grid for it. Now, some of us kind of have a grid for the demonic doing something like that, but not the Lord doing something like that. But it happens, and it has happened multiple times. So you've got that experience. You got it happening to Jesus at least one time. And here's the at least one time. The at least one time was when he was talking to the apostles at the resurrection. And it says that he lifted off the ground and disappeared into the clouds. Like he levitated so high, he just went away and he went into another realm. So that was clearly a levitation. He left the ground and was somewhere else. Now, how did walking on water work? Now, these are the questions I love to ask. Were they levitating and just kind of walking where they were levitating, and so they didn't really need the water to stand on, but they were kind of walking? Or was the water getting hard enough to be able to support their weight? And I say they because both him and Peter did it, but that's an interesting one. So it's possible that was a form of levitation, but we often think of levitation as not touching anything, so completely suspended in air. So I would agree if somebody said, well, that's not really levitation, that's probably something else. However it worked, and that's pretty wild. And okay, but we still have those too. Now, there was a lady by the name of Therese of Avila. So she was a nun, and she was a writer on prayer. She had some of the best writings on prayer. Actually, her book, Interior Castles, one of the better books on prayer that I've ever read, describing the journey that we go on as we try to go into the depths of prayer and the seasons of false visions and false experiences, and how to recognize them as so that we can then discern the true when they come, and what that all looks like. She's got some of the best material on discerning false visions that I've ever read from any time period of the church. It's beautiful, beautiful stuff. Well, there was a period of time when she would pray, and when she would pray, she would just start to float in the air. And it embarrassed her. She did not like that at all. And so she was known to yell at God when this was happening. God, put me down, put me down. Why are you doing to this? Put me down. And at one point in time, she would have some of the nuns sit on top of her so that she wouldn't float, and they would all end up in the air. And that's pretty cool. That's an interesting experience. We have somebody that is trying to sell hair gel. I think we'll get rid of that comment here pretty soon. I just noticed that one pop up. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Trying to sell hair gel and iPhone 4 chargers. So anyways, moving on, distraction. So I have a friend that lives in Great Britain, and she does examinations for the English language. And so she ends up traveling around the world, different places, doing examinations. And one time she was in Italy. And there's a place in Italy where just about 30, 40 years ago, there was one of the priests that was there that was known to float through the air. He was called I think it was like the flying father or something like that. But he was known to float through the air. And while she was there, she just checked up on it and talked to a couple people that had firsthand witnessed this. And he would be a few feet off of the ground, just floating down the street, going to, not all the time, but that would happen regularly. So this kind of thing still happens. Yeah. I'll stop. That God still does weird things. Now, why would God do that? I don't know. That's a really good question. Well, he doesn't have to do it. Well, he doesn't have to do anything. He didn't have to create giraffes. I've got a wooden giraffe on my desk. He didn't have to create giraffes with a long neck, but he wanted to. He didn't have to create, thousands of different shades of green, but he decided to. He didn't have to create a platypus. Like, that's kind of weird. And yet he did. There's a lot of things that he didn't have to do. I mean, he didn't have to create speaking in tongues. I mean, he knew that people were going to have a problem with that, and that they were going to have a problem with anything that they don't understand. And perhaps that's actually the reason why he did it. Because we so quickly want to make an idol out of our understanding and out of our own ability to figure out why, rather than just trusting in a God that is beyond our ability to control or understand. That, I think, is part of the reason why he does some of the stuff. Here's another one. People being taken from one place to another place in the world. So you've got Elijah. And Elijah, probably one of the more famous times out of Elijah's life is when he goes up on Mount Carmel and he confronts the prophets of Baal, calls fire out of the sky that consumes the offering and the stones and the water, and the whole nation turns back to God in a day. Like that's pretty astounding. But that day started a different way. He comes up to this guy, Obadiah, who is working for Ahab, who's a king. And they had been looking around the nation, trying to find where there was enough grass to be able to feed some of the horses, so that if there was a battle, they would at least have some horses and not just be people on foot. So they're trying to find enough waters where there was some grass growing, where there was some grazing, and they were searching the whole nation. So one of them went one way, Ahab goes one way, Obadiah goes the other way. And Elijah catches Obadiah while he's going and says, "Hey, Obadiah, I want you to go tell Ahab that I'm here." And Obadiah's response is like, "Wait a second, like you're crazy. He's searched everywhere for you. He's searched every kingdom around, trying to figure out where you're at, and made them get promises. Like if I tell him you're here and then he comes to try to find you and you're not here, he's going to kill me. I know how this works. As soon as I leave you, the Spirit of the Lord is going to pick you up and take you someplace that I don't know." So Elijah was known to be moved by the Spirit of God to other places. That's interesting. Philip had this experience. This is probably the one that is more well-known in Scripture as far as somebody moving from one place to another. He feels like an angel. Well, he has an angel come and tell him, "Hey, go out to this road and go this direction." So he goes out to the road. He sees the Ethiopian eunuch. He hears the Spirit say, "Go up close to the chariot." He goes up close, gets to preach the gospel. And the guy sees some water. He goes, "Well, there's some water. What's keeping me from getting baptized?" And Philip's like, "Well, nothing. Let's do this thing." So they get down into the water. He baptizes them. As soon as they come up out of the water, Philip disappears and he appears in Azotus, which is 40 miles away. He just disappears out of one place. I mean, this Ethiopian eunuch, he just got baptized, comes out of the water, and the guy that baptized him is gone. Now, I wonder if the Ethiopian eunuch went home and started telling people about his experience meeting an angel. I don't know, but that would probably be most of our thoughts if something like that happened. We're talking to somebody and they tell us something about God and then they just disappear. But that's exactly what happened. So they all disappear, and Philip ends up in Azotus, ends up preaching the gospel. But it actually happened to Jesus too. And this is one that we don't always recognize, but it's pretty clear. There's a couple times when Jesus had his disciples get into the boat, at least two. I mean, some of the synoptic gospels, there's questions on whether it's talking about the same time or different time, but there's at least two. But one of the times they're in the boat, they're going, Jesus goes up on the mountain to pray, and the storm arises and they're resisting. It says that they rowed all night and they'd only gotten like just a little bit across. So they weren't even halfway across the lake. And so Jesus gets down and he starts walking across the lake and he's going to the other side. And they stop him. They're like, "Jesus, like, is that you?" It's like, "Yeah, it's me." "Well, get into the boat." And so he gets into the boat. And it says, and immediately once he gets into the boat, the waves and the wind and the waves stop, the storm stops, and the boat and everybody in it, and possibly more than one boat, because it seems like it says boats, but everybody in it. So the whole group of them end up on the other side. And it says, and immediately they were at the shore. So they go from the middle of the lake to the shore with the boat and all the people in it immediately. Now that's kind of fun. See, that transportations where people go from one place to another place and, instantaneously. I've had a couple experiences where I've been driving and I got there a lot faster than what I thought was normal, but never anything that I could really say, I'm sure that was a transportation. I had a couple times where I was like, ooh, I wonder, because, I'm one of those weird people. I really do my best to obey the speed limit. And so you could pretty much, if you're doing the speed limit, you can pretty much trust the arrival time. And, when that shifts rather quickly, and usually it's when I'm talking about the things of the Lord and I just get caught up and I'm thinking back and I can't remember what happened. Here's a fun story. When John Paul and Bob Jones were ministering together, this is in the 80s. They were at a church in Birmingham, Alabama. So some friends of ours, Michael French, his dad at the time, Bob French, was a pastor of that church. And they had been there ministering, and they'd ministered late at night. They got done with the meeting, and then Bob Jones and John Paul were prophesying over the leadership, and they ended up getting back, and they had an early flight. I think their flight was like 7 a.m., 6:30 a.m. So they get back. They've got just a couple hours to sleep before they've got to get up. And it's a 20-minute drive to get to the airport. Well, next morning, John Paul hears this knock on the door, and it's Bob Jones at the door. He says, John Paul, get up. We're going to be late for our flight. And John Paul gets up. He looks at his watch, and he realizes it's 1 minute before their flight's supposed to leave. And so he's like, well, we'll at least try. Maybe we'll be able to catch another plane. So he just, as quickly as he can, he throws the stuff in his bag and combs his hair and, gets out, and they get into the truck, and it's Bob and his first wife, Viola, and John Paul, and they're in Bob's red pickup truck, and they drive off to the airport. And they're driving and just talking about the night before and how they're going to get there. And when they get to the airport, there's a couple guys standing on the side. They're waiting where you would stop and let somebody out. So before they got to their parking and say, hey, just take your bags, run to the gate. They're holding the plane. You'll be able to make it. We'll take care of the car. And so they don't even think about it. They just, they grab the bags and they're running off to the plate. John Paul was a little bit athletic, so he got there faster, and he's like, hey, hold the plane, don't close the plane. And they're like, it's okay, you've got a minute or two before we're going to close the plane. So they, that Bob and Viola get in there, they sit down in the plane, and John Paul looks at his watch, and it's just time for the plane to leave. They'd had a 20-minute ride and all the other stuff, running through the airport, getting out of the hotel, and it had all happened in about 1 minute. And so he's looking at Bob, and he's like, Bob, did you call those people to park your car? And he's like, no, I didn't call them. I thought you called them. No, I didn't call them. Well, we'll find out if it was the Lord when we get back. And so when they got back, the car was sitting right there, first parking spot in the parking lot. But that was an instantaneous transportation, either that or just time stopped, or however that stuff works. I mean, I don't understand how this stuff works. And that's the beautiful thing about it. Like it's God stuff. You don't get to understand all of it. Sometimes things just happen. So you've got something like that. Here's one. It was a newer teaching back in the 80s when John Paul first started talking about this. Then since then, there's a number of people that have talked about this. You may have heard somebody talk about this or not, but it's one of those things that's not so clear in scripture, but there's some allusions to it that seems to point to it. The whole thing of heavenly lights. Now, some of you have heard about that. Maybe some of you haven't. If you've ever heard John Paul's teaching, naturally supernatural, he he's talking, he goes through basically kind of like what I'm talking about, but a lot more in depth. And he tells a number of more stories and some biblical stories of some of these things, talking about these weird things that God does when he interacts with his people. So heavenly light. So there's this passage in Acts where Paul is there preaching, and he preaches way past midnight. Remember, they're in the upper room, and the young man falls asleep and falls out the window and dies. And then Paul resurrects him from the dead and then goes back up and finishes preaching. So during that whole time, so when Luke is telling this story, Luke says, and Paul preached way past midnight, and there were many lights in the room. Now, the word for lights could be lamps or lights, luminaries, sources of light. So it's all the same word. That particular word can be used a couple different ways. So some translations say lamps, some say lights, but yeah, it's one of those weird things to say. If you were writing a story, maybe you're telling your friend about something that happened. Yeah, hey, I was at church, and man, the service went long. It was almost midnight, and they still had all the lights on. Like, well, of course they had the lights on. Duh. That would just be normal. That's not something that you would normally point out in a story. Now, if you were a fiction writer, or you were, somebody who was very expressive and trying to fill in all the details, but if you look at Luke's writings, this is the book of Acts, so Luke wrote this, but about Paul. You take a look at that, it's not normal for him to say something like that. And he points out that there were many lights in the room. And that it's a possibility that those lights were actually supernatural lights and not physical lights. So you've got a couple different things that would support that scripturally. So one, you have in James, where God is called the Father of lights. So you have this principle throughout scripture where God gets talked about as light. And we are lights. It says that he makes his ministers flames of fire. So ministering angels can be flames of fire. This idea of lights flashing in and out, when Ezekiel sees some of the living creatures around God's throne, it says that he sees lights flashing out of them. So they're kind of moving around, these lights that are coming in and out of the presence of God, in and out of these angelic beings. And there's these lights that are happening. And there have been a number of experiences, throughout. If you look at some of the older pictures throughout the history of the church, you look at some of the older pictures of the saints, there's this picture that often gets where they have this big light that kind of goes around their head. You ever wonder where that came from? I've actually got a picture. I can't find it anymore, but we had it for a while of one time where I was preaching, where I actually had a light. It was this circle of light like this, clearly defined, that was sitting right in my head in the picture. And a number of times where there is a lot of supernatural activity, people will catch these lights or little orbs, some people call them, because they're usually circular, on film. Now, sometimes that's just dust, and sometimes that's a reflection of lights reflecting off of the camera lens. And that is a reality, that some of that is there. But there are times where it's clearly not that. I've got one particular picture where I was ministering to someone, and there was a pink orb with all of these details in it. There's so much texture to it. It was right there. And that there was a number, almost every meeting, every picture from that meeting had lights and orbs in it. But that one was so distinct and so clear that it would arrest your attention quickly when you look at the picture. These kinds of things happen on a regular basis. God has never stopped interacting with his people, and he releases supernatural activity, and it doesn't all fit within the grids that we like, or that we consider normal in our scientific modern age. There's so much more to what's available. And we've got to realize that our God has never stopped being God, and that what we've experienced is not everything that there is, that there's a whole lot more to reality than the physical world. There's also a spiritual world, and there's an interaction between that spiritual world and this physical world. And that includes beings that are persons in that spiritual world that will sometimes cross over into this world. Sometimes we get to cross over into that world. Sometimes they get to cross over into this world. And that movement, when it happens, there's real tangible things that happen. And so you can end up having somebody physically show up or be somewhere and then just disappear. Or maybe not disappear, walk away, and you don't realize they disappear. But when these things happen, there's the important piece. We need to keep our focus on Jesus, because the point of these things are not so that we would get caught up in the supernatural experience. Those are just normal things that happen. It's like seeing a tree on the side of the road. It's not so we're supposed to worship the tree. It's like, wow, I mean, God made trees. Like, that's just one of the trees that he made. That's pretty cool. And so if we can keep all of this stuff in the context of, man, our God is really amazing, and we get to do this stuff and experience him in ways that are beyond what people would consider normal from a scientific, merely naturalistic worldview. If we can actually change into a biblical worldview, we will start to recognize more and more how much he's actually involved. It doesn't make him more involved. We just start to realize that he's more involved. So that's what I wanted to share. I'm going to take a look and see if there are questions. I noticed that there's some dreams people are posting. I'm not going to be doing dream interpretation today. We try to switch back and forth. So next week will be dream interpretation. This week is more of a teaching time. But let me take a look at some of these questions. We'll see if we get some other discussion. So let's see. Dominique asked, what reason would angels be more in a certain room? You know, there's a number of reasons. So sometimes it's consecrated space. So there is this, when a space is set aside for God, or when God visits a certain space, there seems to be like a spiritual residue, for a lack of a better term, where spiritual things tend to happen. So there are certain places where God shows up, and when God shows up powerfully, then there, in that same place, there are other experiences. So God meets with Abraham at Bethel. Abraham changes the name to Bethel. Then God meets with Jacob at Bethel. Jacob, I guess the other people that lived there didn't change the names. Jacob says again, Bethel, and calls it Bethel. And then you have later in the time of the prophet, Samuel actually set up a school of the prophets at Bethel. There seemed to be something that was going on in that place where there was spiritual activity that was available, and specifically angelic activity. So you have that experience. So there does seem to be something about specific places. And you know, the why is a good question. And, you know, I'm always looking at that. So, you know, why did that happen? You know, hunger causes things to happen when we cry out. Like we have this room here at our ministry center. It's actually on the other side of the wall behind me, that way. That prayer room, and we've set it aside only for prayer. So we don't have conversation in there unless it's related to God. We go in there to pray, to minister to people, just to worship, to be silent, to hear from God, to prophesy. It's consecrated space. And as we have cultivated that atmosphere is pregnant. And we constantly have people talking, saying that they've seen angels in there, that they've experienced angels interacted with angels in there. And angels tend to show up where God is. And so we haven't put our focus in having angels there. Our focus is in God. Like, this is your space. We want to meet with you, and we can meet with him anywhere. But there's something about saying, I'm willing to set aside this space that is just for you, because it's saying something to me about my dedication, and God responds to those kinds of things. And so God has responded, and there's a beautiful presence in that. One of the things that I've recognized is when there's an angel, I tend to, like, if I notice that an angel is in a particular place in the room, I like to go to that particular space, not to engage the angel, but to engage with God. And like, if there's an angel there, then, I'll have people come and, hey, let me pray for you right here. And I've had some astounding experiences where where I recognized an angelic presence. And sometimes it's just a knowing that I have. Sometimes it's a physical feeling. Sometimes I can actually see it in my mind's eye. And very few times I've actually seen something with my physical eyes. I tend to see more with the eyes of the spirit or the eyes of the heart than with my physical eyes when I'm seeing in the spiritual realm. So, all that to be said, I recognize in one of those ways that there's angelic. And there's been times where there's been astounding breakthrough for people, physical healings, miracles, shifts. One time where we had a couple people that have been dealing with depression for over 10 years, two different people. I can't remember the times. Both of them were over 10 years. They weren't the same period of time. Got completely freed in that. So those kinds of, when I recognize it, then I realize, okay, so if this angel is from God, then God is doing something. I'm going to agree with God. God, what are you doing? How can I engage with that? So that, hopefully that helps. So Dominique, you had this experience, is walking out of a movie theater and suddenly time slowed down and everything went quiet and I heard God speak, but no one else noticed. That is amazing. I love those examples. Like, he does these wonderful things. He arrests our attention. And, there's a naturalistic worldview would say, well, if it was real, if it was God, then everybody would experience it. But it's actually not true. So that I mentioned naturally supernatural, which is this John Paul teaching through some of the stuff. Well, when he started talking about the heavenly lights in that teaching, heavenly lights showed up in the room. And there was, I think it was 350, maybe 450, either 350 or 450 people in the room that all saw them, other than 5 people. So there were 5 people in the room that didn't see anything, and they didn't understand what everybody else, but everybody else is freaking out. There are all these lights and they're moving around the room and zooming, and they would kind of, some of them would come down and be like they were coming, they were going to hit somebody, and people would just duck. And like, it was pandemonium. It was beautiful. The presence of God came. It was thick. It was rich. But there were people there that didn't see anything. Now, there's a couple things. One, that proves that it wasn't fake, that there wasn't a light show, that somebody was, just hidden how they were doing it. I mean, 2, this was 87. I think it was 1987. So they didn't really have they had light shows, but not anywhere near what we have today, with LED lights and all the laser lights and all that possibility. So it proved that it was a real supernatural experience, where somebody else would say, well, if it was real, everybody would see it. But that's just not the case. Okay. Man who plays with E. Actually, correction, the airport was an hour away. I remember JP telling me this in the 90s. Thank you for that. Yeah, I remember the story, and I remember the 2 of them, and I remember the truck. I couldn't remember exactly how long. I thought it was 20, 25 minutes, but very possible that I had mistaken that time. So thank you for that. Awesome. Yay. Okay. So that's what happened to Dan McCollum. He got there way faster. Okay, so I was talking about the transportations where you go from one place to another place. Yeah, that is so fun. I've got a few friends that have had experiences. Some of them a lot more tangible. I have a friend that was driving home, and it was going to be like a 3-hour drive, and got there in 15 minutes. And they like that, like I've gotten there, 20, 30 minutes faster than what I should have. And I'm just not quite sure, did time slow or did time speed up or however that works. But that is, man, it's so much fun when that stuff happens. Okay. So Vanalee, what do you think is the God side of multiple timelines and that sort of thing? Yeah, so basic understanding of multiple timelines is kind of related to what's been lately called the multiverse. So this idea that there's multiple realities that are slightly different because of choices and decisions. I don't think that is accurate at all. There is one God, there's one faith, there's one baptism. There's not multiple realities in that way that are going on. So that would be my thought. God created time and he is outside of time. So he does stuff that is outside of time. He can see the end and he can see the beginning and he sees everything in between all at once. But the idea that there is multiple versions of me or multiple versions, that would mean that there are multiple versions of God, which the Bible clearly says is not true. So I don't think that is true. I don't think that's possible. Oh, yeah. Okay, somebody mentioning I'm not really doing dream interpretation. I can't fit in my dream, so I had to type it strange. Yeah, I do apologize. I am not. That's what that was. Okay, so I thought that was an advertise. We've had bots, not on our. Actually, I don't know if they've been on our YouTube channel, but we've actually had bots that have tried to throw up advertisements, and sometimes it's for hair gel and for technology. So I saw a couple things, and they usually will have like some caps and some not caps, and I saw that, and I thought, oh. I didn't even think of that possibility of that being a way of trying to type in a dream in a reduced format. So I apologize for that. And yes, that is accurate. I'm not actually doing the dream interpretation this week. I'll be doing it next week. Let's see. Vessel music. It puzzled me. Where did this guy go? So let's see. You were probably type something else. A homeless man that disappears second after asking for money. Yeah, I mean, it's very possible. Like that's the type of thing that has happened. I've got a friend of mine that they were driving across country and their car broke down. They got blue smoke coming out of the hood. And it was Sunday morning. And this was back in the 80s. So this was when most garages are not open on Sunday, and they were able to get to a little diner right off of the interstate exit and before they felt like they just couldn't keep on driving. They were afraid the engine was going to blow up. They'd heard it worse. And so they decide they're going to get breakfast while they're waiting for hopefully, a garage would open if there was any open that day. So they're sitting there eating breakfast, and somebody opens up the door to the diner and says, "Hey, who owns this car out here?" And they describe their car, like, "Oh, that's ours." "Hey, let me take a look at it." And so they didn't even think, like, it didn't even register that was weird to them. So they just go out there and say, "Oh, pop open the hood. Let me take a look." And so they pop open the hood, and they're sitting in the car. They say, "Okay, when I tell you, I want you to, turn the ignition and pump the gas." And so, after a few minutes, "Okay, turn the ignition." And so they turn the ignition and it starts right up. It doesn't have the same noise that it had. There's no smoke coming out. They get out of the car to thank the guy, and he's nowhere around. And their car was fixed. They didn't have another problem with it. Like that type of stuff, man, I love that. God is so amazing. Let's see. Just looking through some of the comments. So LM, so is this the same as when God said, let us go down and see what they're doing at Mount Babel? So no, this is not about the Tower of Babel. That was in Genesis chapter 10 before the time of Abraham. This is actually about Sodom and Gomorrah. And God said, let us go down and see what's happening at Sodom and Gomorrah. So yeah, that was a different experience. So, and here's another question. So, Vessel Music, will Streams Ministries ever venture into music and training musicians prophets? Yes, we definitely are. We're waiting for God to bring the right person to do that training. But that is something that God has spoken to us about. We've actually just got a prophetic word this last year about a school of musicians. And so we are trying to develop a group of musicians here. And once we get the right person to do that training and that equipping, we will be developing that and making that available. So most definitely that is on our heart and in our prayers. It's on our radar. So we're just waiting for God to open up the right door at the right time so that we can step into that and see it happen. So, well, it looks like that is all of our comments. Let's see in this. So here's a question. Josephine, what do you think about the revival of Asbury in Kentucky? There's a couple things that I really like. So I got on YouTube and I watched the very first service where it started. And the guy did this beautiful message about loving one another. And it was good. And I'm watching it and I'm thinking, okay, well, this doesn't feel like, I've been in Moves of God. It doesn't feel the same. And, maybe it's video. I just like, okay, what's going on? And then I finished the video and I just wanted to turn everything off and just be quiet and just be with God. And I was really weepy. And I'm like, ooh, now that's definitely God. Like the fruit of it was so beautiful and so clean. And it didn't have that kind of fire thing that was kind of more popular 15 years ago. That seemed to be what was going on, but it was deep and it was gentle and it was the presence of God and the fragrance of God. I was really encouraged by that. And then watching the humility, and then I guess they just, as of yesterday was the last time that they were going to have public services. That they were having these big services. People were coming from all over, and they shut it down, and they're only letting in people from 18 to 25, and then focusing on the students there because that's what God was doing, and that's the people that God started touching. I think that's beautiful. It talks about their humility. They don't have to make it a big thing and see how many people they can get into it. They're not trying to market it and merchandise it. They're just trying to be faithful to the presence of God and preserve what it is that God is doing. That right there, I thought was a sign of real maturity and self-control and humility in the leadership to be able to make a choice like that. I thought it was wonderful. Let me see. Bald dad, 3 boys. All right. There seems to be people who pursue these things and don't pursue God. In other words, pursuing spiritual first to have these kinds of experiences, but not the Lord. Could you comment on this? Yes, that is a problem. See, the thing about spiritual experiences is they're supposed to lead us to an encounter with God, or they come out of an encounter with God. You can have spiritual experiences without God. And that's the real problem. If you pursue spiritual things, you're going to get spiritual things. You may or may not got in the mix. If you pursue God, actually pursue God for who he is, not for who you're trying to make him to be, you will end up with spiritual experiences. but those spiritual experiences will cause you to pursue God more. And so you're looking for the fruit of things. The fact that something is supernatural doesn't say anything. There's all kinds of supernatural. The, Jannes and Jambres, which were the priests in Egypt, they were able to fake miracles. They could turn water into blood and cause frogs to appear out of nowhere. Like they can make their staffs turn into snakes. And there was real power there, and it was supernatural, and it was demonic. And it didn't, like, it was just, it was the same thing God was doing. God turned a stick into a serpent. They turned a stick into a serpent. So you can't say, well, God only does this and the enemy only does this. Well, no, the enemy tries his best to imitate whatever God does. And so that there are some things that God will not do. He will not violate his own character. So that is accurate. But there's a lot of supernatural activity that it's just there, like levitation. Like you can't say, well, God won't do that. Only the devil would do that. Well, the Bible would tell you you're wrong. Like clearly that happens. And clearly it happens from God, by God. And so you've got to have a grid for that if you're going to believe the Bible is true. So our pursuit has to be about pursuing God and trying to be faithful. And in that, you find things happening. If you just pursue the experiences, you may or may not find God. I had a time period. This is actually, it's the only time when John Paul rebuked me in public. It was I think it's actually on one of the fireside chats that we have. So it was back in 2005 or so. And I was learning about a lot of this stuff and realizing what's available. And there's a story about Elisha, who after he healed Naaman, and Gehazi went and followed after Naaman to get some stuff from him after Elisha said he wasn't going to take anything from him. And it says that when Gehazi came back in, Elisha asked him, well, where did you go? Oh, I didn't go anywhere. He goes, why are you lying to me? Did not my spirit go with you when the man came down from his chariot? So Elisha said, hey, I was actually there in the spirit while I was sitting here in my house when that happened. So his spirit went someplace that his body didn't go. Paul, he tells two different congregations, hey, by the way, when you gather together and my spirit is present in your midst and you recognize it. So he was in prison, but his spirit would show up in a church meeting and people would recognize that that was his spirit that was there. Then do such and such because you're going to have the authority to do it. So I was realizing, wait, hey, there's something to this. And so I started, trying to figure out how to do it. And so I would do these practices. And so I'm like, hey, John Paul, like I'm, figuring this out. I know this is in scripture and I'm trying to do this. And he's stop it. Like, don't do that. Is that if you do that, you can do that on your own and you may find out that God's not there. Now you can ask God to do anything with you, but don't try to make it happen. And one of the things that I've noticed again and again is when like teachings like this, we start talking about the supernatural things that are available. There is this fascination with paranormal activity that has crept into the church, and it's really dangerous because people begin to pursue after these things, and it's not out of a hunger to expand the kingdom. It's not out of hunger to get closer to the Lord. It's not out of a hunger to obey him. It's just, I want to have an experience because I want to have an experience. There is no problem with asking God to give you any of these experiences. Don't turn down that hunger. In your prayer to God, I want to transport from this place to that place. Lord, I want to experience that. I want to see that. Lord, I would love to levitate sometime. I think that would be fun. Lord, I want to walk through walls. Lord, I want to see miracles. I want to see angels. Lord, I want you to give me whatever I need to be able to accomplish your kingdom. There's not a problem. But if you start seeking those things by seeking those things and not doing it by engaging the Lord, you've put yourself in a very dangerous place, and you may end up getting those things and whatever else comes with it. And whatever else comes with it is usually not God. So be very, very careful. That is a great point. Thank you so much for asking that question. So hey, we've gone a little bit late. It's we're over an hour right now. I usually try to keep these a little bit shorter, but this is just a fun conversation. I know we've got a couple questions that are left here that I wasn't able to get to, but for time's sake, I apologize. We're gonna end this for today. Next week, when we do live at 5 at Wednesday, we'll be doing some dream interpretation, and I look forward to seeing you there. God bless you guys.